So, I want to talk today about the globital age. So I'm going to kind of telescope out largely from the empirical, although I've done a lot of empirical work myself, and think about how we might reconceptualize the epoch in which we live and the purchase that might then have in the context of the museum. What I want to start with then is thinking about the continuities and discontinuities of material culture. And I think a good starting place is the work of Umberto Eco, who suggests that there are three kinds of memory. And I should say that I'm coming to thinking about the context of how we might rethink digital existence through the prism of memory. I would define myself not as an anthropologist or a sociologist or even a media scholar really, but as a nomologist, which is one of those made-up words. When you don't have a word for something, I've discovered that's what I am. Over the course of a 30-year career, I am a nomologist, one who studies memory, one who thinks about memory, cultural memory, individual memory, human memory. And what Umberto Eco helpfully says is, with these three kinds of memory, the first one is organic, and the second one is mineral, and the third one is the way in which memory is based on electronic memory of today's computers. And he says that this is based on silicon, and that in itself, as you'll see in the course of my talk, is slightly dated too, because I'm going to talk about minerals such as europium and their significance to how we might think about the materiality of digital existence. Before I talk about discontinuities, though, and how then, as curators, as people working in museums, you and I might think about how we might then curate and think about collections, there are also, of course, continuities. And I came across this runestone on a trip in the autumn to Sweden. And I was walking along a lake near the village of Sigtuna. And there was this marvellous runestone, and I took a photo. And I just love what the stone says. The translation said, "Anand had the stone erected in memory of himself in his lifetime." Well, what's new, really? It's a selfie, isn't it? It's a stone selfie, okay? So we might think that digital practices are very different. But are they really? Perhaps it's the kind of media through which we're thinking about selfies and digital practices. And perhaps it's also partly conceptual in that we tend to think of the digital as words like virtual have been used this morning, cyberspace. I'd like us, in the course of what I'm trying to say in this talk, to rematerialise how we think about our globital existence. So I want to explain this term globital then, and this is one that I've made up. My original training was in literature, so you tend to kind of enjoy making up new words. As you probably guessed, this might be one of my children. Okay, this is one of my children, and I forced her to write out the word globital many times on the beach. I think this is about the 10th shot on the Isle of Wight. It was very rainy, British holiday destination. But really to kind of illustrate the materiality of the globital. And as Eco has suggested, memory in human cultures is material and energetic. And the word globital is the bringing together of two words, global with bit, to signify that we need to think about these processes of globalization and digitization and digitality as contiguous forces, as synergetic dynamics. And the word is also in English difficult to say. It trips on the tongue, globital. It's meant to be, okay? And it signifies that smallest contiguous sequence of data meshed with global, bit. It's difficult to say because actually, as we've seen this morning, this process is uneven. Some people are highly connected. We are in the top 1% of the world's elite in terms of our connectivity, in terms of the digital existences that we have the privilege to live. And there are those who are much less connected, and there are people who are connected in different ways. But actually, the globital memory field is something that penetrates our bodies from before birth, and it extends to the far reaches of the seen universe. And I mean that in the kind of Bourdieusian sense of field. This is a new kind of cultural technocratic field which we are born into and we die in. So it's unevenly then transforming human memory. It's transforming all sorts of practices, but as I said, my focus is really around how we think about memory, and particularly since museums have become memory institutions, how do we think about human memory in that context, in terms of human memory, languages, discourses, practices, rituals, forms? I wanted to make sure that I'd evenly included both of my children. So the first one was my daughter. This is my son. He wants me to tell you that he's no longer that small. He is this big. He's 11, okay? But this is really by way of suggesting then that we are very much immersed in this uneven, globital memory. And it penetrates, as I said, inside of our bodies through things like medical imagery, which is then externalized. And the other thing that I think is really significant about the globital age is the way in which certain established binaries, which conceptually within academia we've been challenging for decades, are themselves also challenged within the globital age. So the notion of private and public memory are continually crossed and crisscrossed through things like Facebook, for example, and YouTube. The organic and inorganic are challenged, as we've seen in the papers this morning. They kind of crisscross between the two. And in the image that you see on screen, that's not just an image of my son prior to birth. It's also, and I'm going to embarrass you now, it's an image from the inside of my womb, okay? And we background that sense, don't we, in looking at an image from the inside of ourselves. And the organic and the inorganic is crisscrossed rapidly in that way. And one of the things I've sought to develop in the idea of the globital age, globital memory, this sense of the globital memory field, is that we actually also need new kinds of analysis, not to supersede or take away from or take over from established modes of analysis, it's to add on to them, so that we can think about the significance of movement and trajectory and mobilization. And we've seen again that in the papers that we've heard this morning. So the ways in which memories are mobilized and then also securitized through institutions such as museums is important for us, you and I, to be aware of, it seems to me, rather than only thinking about the discrete object, the fixed moment. We need to be aware of how one can track and trace digitization, digitality, digital processes, digital objects within the globital age. And in the course of doing many different case studies really over the past 10 years, some of which have been very domestic projects, looking at, for example, the ways in which people use mobile phones to remember, through to how news organisations mobilise images of witnessing in relation to terrorism. In addition, looking at museums, for example, and how museums have changed their practices in relation to digitally remembering the Holocaust and building in interactivity within Holocaust museums internationally. From those different kinds of case studies, it struck me that actually there are a number of key trajectories that one can then be aware of. And it's not that then we have to be aware of all of them all at once, and it's not that this is definitive, it's just a suggestion really. And one of the things that I think is really important, and again we've seen it this morning, is the significance of transmediality and the way in which digitisation enables rapid transmediality. And so you also have the emergence of the field of transmedia storytelling, for example. So the question then that elicits is, how might museums show the extent? And I've put memory here, but you can kind of substitute, your own particular field of interest, in which the globital age is transformed into and between different media within different cultures. Secondly, what's also important is velocity. And that, I'm not assuming here that, some things everything is all speeded up, as Virillo would suggest, or Harvey. Actually, I would suggest it's uneven. Some things are very fast, for others they're very slow. And also a feature of the globital age is multiple temporalities that we experience. And all of you are doing that. You may be, thinking about an email, or an email's just come in, you may have your mobile phone on, you're also here, you're operating across multiple temporalities. Thirdly, extensity. So how might museums then explore the limit and reach of assemblages from the historical point of origin? And again, we saw that in the papers this morning. Through diaspora, you might have, the plastic beads emerging from one place, and then you can trace things, through YouTube and their representation, and then back to being re-embodied with a student on the streets of London. Okay, and I think tracing and tracking that within the context of museum displays is actually really important, and moving away from a sense of stasis and fixity. Fourthly, then, modality. And museums are very used to thinking about codes and conventions and sets of patterns, such as ceremonial forms, protocols and conditions and so on. But what's interesting then in the globital age is the extent to which modalities can switch very rapidly. So the image of my son prior to him being born, that was taken for a medical reason. You could see in the corner that it had a kind of medical stamping to it. It said Lewisham Hospital, okay? And it was taken for that purpose of nuchal scanning. But then I've used it as do many others, to show family members. It's printed out in my family album, and I also use it in the course of my work. So it changes modality in a way that possibly other artifacts don't. Valency then is also really important, and if you know your chemistry, valency is the degree to which there are sticky points between things. And what the globital age facilitates, it seems to me, are greater sticky points between different kinds of stories. So the research that I've done on digital memory of the Romani communities, heterogeneous Romani communities within Europe, has shown that it has enabled the Romani community to develop greater sticky points with other stories of, for example, the Nazi Holocaust. Okay? And it has allowed their story, therefore, to gain greater purchase publicly. So being attentive to those sticky points is important, so that you can articulate stories in new and different ways that have purchase with your communities. And finally, viscosity. So being attentive to the way in which, as museum curators, you may seek to fix something, securitize something within the context of the museum, but that in the globital age it will have perhaps greater liquidity, to use Bauman's term. And to be aware then of these X and Y trajectories, the extent to which displays can show the mobilization and securitization of a variety of different actors and memory agents is important. So I'm now going to just move on to two further parts to this talk. One is to suggest that it's important to think about the materiality within the context of museums within the globital age, and how and why one might do that. And the second is to think about three key themes to digital existence that are important within the globital age. Now, most of you may save your material to the cloud, and the cloud is deemed to be kind of ephemeral, clean, green, etc. And the research that I've done, it's actually the very opposite of that. And neither is it something that is held in common. It's deeply material. It involves digging under the earth, going over the earth. It's also involves a great deal of resources in terms of water and electricity. So when one is thinking about digital artifacts, digitality, invoking this sense of the materiality through connectivity is also, it seems to me, really important. It also gobbles up land and resources, not just within cities, but also outside of cities. And these are also the research that I'm doing at the moment as a part of an Australian Research Council bid, is looking at the ways in which data centres are largely invisible. Many of you won't know, for example, where within Leiden your local data centre is, and yet lots of your data will go through it. Much of this will have gone through it, okay, as I emailed it to you, or it probably will have gone through several other dispersed centres. And that, it seems to me, is also part of representing the globital age, as is too the postures, gestures, practices that are carried out within those memory environments. Because the data centres are the materialisation of our memories that we talk about as being virtual. Those are part of the material places. And this is, one of the people who works in one of those places, carrying out particular gestural acts and rituals every day as part of his labour. In addition to that, the materiality of the globital age comes from the earth. And I always carry a rock around with me in my Wonder Woman handbag as a reminder, actually, that we come from the earth. And so too does this image. The red on that image that you see, and I would normally, I have to say, show some rock art, but I was kind of aware that there would be specialists in the audience, and I'm not, okay? So I didn't want to kind of talk about, Western Australian rock art when I'm not a specialist. But what's so interesting then to reference that is when you have digitisation projects, they often, and I've been looking into this with my colleague Tanya Notley in Australia, then destroy, in the production of new images, there is also then the destruction, very often, of 40,000-year-old rock art sites. So the production of red in that image, the red that you see, or the red on a rock art image that may have been digitised, comes from a particular mineral called europium. It's interesting, it's called europium, and we're in Europe. And europium then has to be processed as a rare earth in a very complicated way. It's not that rare earths are rare, they're all over the planet, but they're difficult to extract, they're difficult to process, and there's also a degree of radioactivity in their processing. And rare earths are essential to electronic goods. They're essential to you living your life in the globital age. And one particular company that I've been tracking in a project that I've been involved in has then outsourced its processing of rare earths to Penang in Malaysia. So it ships the materials from Western Australia to Penang, which is a special economic zone. But this has resulted in protests. And we did some interviews with some of the protesters about their use of digital protests to communicate with people around the world about what Lynas, which is the largest processing plant in the world in Penang of rare earths, are doing. And so one of the interviewees said, if the waste is not handled properly, it may leak into the environment. This can happen via air waste, water waste, or solid waste. This may kill the marine life, endanger the population of Kuantan, and endanger any flora and fauna within Kuantan. Of course, they too are implicated agents. The red on the screen is produced, the vibrancy of it, through europium. So we are all implicated agents within these processes that enable us to live our digital existence within the globital age. And then there's also what happens to our electronic gadgets when they die. And this is one place they go when they die. Some of my research shows that actually people just keep their gadgets in their wardrobe for all sorts of personal reasons. Even if they can't access the data on them, they like to keep them in their wardrobes and attics. So that in and of itself is also really interesting. But much of our electronic waste goes to China, and many of those that process our electronic waste are women, low-paid women, who then are subject to the fumes that arise when the plastic is burnt off the gold that they need to access to then resell. So what I'm saying here is there's a whole commodity chain that is both energetic and material that is key to understanding the globital age. It's not about images on screen. It's not about digital artifacts. It is those things, but it's also this sense of infrastructure that is also quite fixed, and it's also about exploitation and a new form of colonization and slave labor that's key to electronic memory and digital memory. How then might we think about, and this is just a kind of tentative suggestion, I was thinking about, if you were to have, I was imagining a kind of museum space, how would you thematize it and think then about digital existence, bearing in mind the energetic and the materiality of the globital age? Well, what I've thought about in terms of my own work is the significance of digital existence in terms of birth, life, and death, and moving from the body to the home to the kind of public space, and looking at the trajectories that crisscross between them and across them. And I was thinking then, what kind of material or immaterial evidence might be included? If you're looking at a museum of computers and they have all these, various different PCs that go back to, early 1980s and 70s. But you might also think about visual and quantitative evidence of globital infrastructures. You might think about digital data. You might think about globital practices and gestures. What's important, though, it seems to me, in order to kind of de-immersify ourselves from our globital existence, which is very difficult to think about because we spend our whole lives within it now, it seems to me that within a museum environment, it's always really useful then to see these points of contrast. So in a book that I've got in production at the moment, and that's not an advert for it, is to look at, for example, birth, globital birth in relation to birth and maternity practices 100 years ago. And this is a really interesting book that was published at the turn of the early part of the 20th century in Britain in the campaign to have maternity rights for women. So it's part of that first wave of feminism. And one woman says, "I've had 4 children and all were born 1.5 years after each other. My 2 eldest died in 1 week from whooping cough, aged 5 and 3. 2 of my children were stillborn. I was very young at the time and only wished this maternity scheme had come out years ago." She also says, "I do hope I have not done wrong in relating so much of my past and that it may be of some use in the furthering of our scheme." Contrast that then with the way in which, particularly in the privileged 1%, we circulate through mobile and social technologies images of the fetus. And the ways in which you've now got commercial enterprises worldwide that will enable those people to buy images of the fetus. "Phenomenal experience," says one woman. "Now I know what she's up to in there. Such a beautiful baby shown to us by fantastic staff. Fab gel too." They always mention the gel, it's really interesting. "We cannot thank you enough." But then there's also, what happens if a baby doesn't make it to term, and what happens if a baby is stillborn or dies shortly after it's born. And so you have then digital practices, thinking about, this theme of birth, that are then interfacing with older practices. So, for example, practices in Japan around the mizuko or the water baby. And this is a site, for example, that looks at memorializing babies that have not lived long or didn't make it into the world. Then if we're thinking about the theme global home or home life, what's important, it seems to me, is to move beyond the gesture of the selfie and actually think about the importance of mundane memories. Mundane memories are very important, it seems to me, to preserve in some ways and to have a sense of within the global age. If you just track the kind of material that you have on your mobile phone, everything from can you remember to buy bread, through to important photos of your family, for example. Within that, then, there are what we can call mundane memories that are important and that then act as metonyms for important routine practices. The image of the empty plate of a child is then a metonym for all the effective labour of the father or mother that has gone into shopping, cooking, feeding, a fussy toddler that won't normally eat such and such food, okay? And that image bespeaks that. And those kind of images, in that sense, within the global age, are new. Prior to that, photography would have emphasised the important rituals of weddings, namings, etc. Within global home life too, and we've seen this in other contexts, the mobile phone in particular is a portal to an archive, to a world, and certainly in the research that I've done recently in a South London school, it suggests that the mobile phone therefore provides new kinds of trajectories, especially for parents, predominantly women in Britain at home with their children. However, it's then important to be attentive to the unevenness of that and the different practices associated with that. So if you look at a study, studies carried out, for example, in northern India, you will find that upon marriage, many women have their mobile phone taken from them. So they don't necessarily have the access to that sense of connection, and they will have to share a phone with their husband. So again, thinking about the 1% in relation to the 99% is important. And finally then, and you can see why I've got my Wonder Woman handbag up here, is thinking then about the ways in which within the global age, this provides different kinds of voices for crafting online different news sources. So this is the Situation Room image, which you may remember, which was shortly after Osama bin Laden was shot dead by US SEALs. And in lieu of an image of his body, which was state-controlled by the US, this image of the not this image, but a different image of the Situation Room was circulated, and then it resulted in many, many different versions as people worldwide through Tumblr kind of gave it their own twist. And this was one of my favourites. My other favourite was one rebuilt in Lego and then rephotographed. So just to summarise then, it's important to think about the kind of materiality, it seems to me, of the globital age, and think about not just the object or the digital in terms of representation, but as a whole way of life in which you and I are imbued from birth through to death. And the evidence that we might include might be hardware, it might be artifacts, it might be objects, it might be digital data, but it's also then art projects, popular culture, ethnographic links and comparisons. Thank you very much.